The Galactic King thought he captured 3 helpless human girls. He paraded them before 12 galaxies as trophies, smirking as he asked what threat they could possibly pose. But Minister Rock knew better. He whispered one word of caution. Girls. Their calm was unnerving, their composure absolute. This wasn't a capture. It was the beginning of his end. The grand hall glittered with chandeliers carved from the spinal columns of extinct star leviathans. Each crystal shard caught the light of a dozen suns, projecting fractured rainbows across vaulted ceilings that stretched into artificial twilight. Before this spectacle stood 12 delegations from conquered galaxies, heads bowed not in respect but under the weight of gem-encrusted ceremonial collars. Their silence was the only tribute the king required. He placed the 3 human women at the center of the hall, positioning them like sculptures in a gallery of subjugation. Their restraints were not chains, but delicate bands of polished lumanium, gleaming with soft light. To the court, these were ornaments, symbols of a king's reach extending even to the mythical blue planet. He smiled as he circled them, a performer savoring his audience's silent approval. Behold, his voice rang across the hall, smooth as polished stone, the pride of Earth, brought here not by worship or treaty but by the sheer elegance of invitation. He paused before the tallest of the 3, tilting her chin up with the edge of his scepter. Tell me, what threat could such grace possibly pose? Minister Rock did not stand with the others. He remained near the archway, one hand resting against cold marble as if drawing truth from the stone itself. His eyes tracked not the king's theatrics but the women's hands, their stillness. The way their breathing remained even, untouched by the grandeur or the humiliation. The hall itself was a chronicle of victories. Banners hung from conquered systems, weapons mounted like art. Even the floor tiles bore the insignias of broken regimes. And now these 3, silent, watchful, unbroken, stood as the latest exhibits. Only Rock seemed to understand they were not conclusion but prologue. Guards stationed at the 4 pillars shifted subtly. Their grip tightened on pulse spears. No alert showed on their helmets' displays, no biometric spike from the prisoners. Yet an unease traveled through the ranks like a low current. Something in the women's posture defied reading. Their calm felt less like submission and more like containment. The king saw only props in his theater of power. He mistook their silence for shock, their composure for defeat. Each smirk, each condescending gesture layered another stone onto the path of his own undoing. He had not captured 3 women. He had imported an outcome his minister knew better. Rock's eyes narrowed as one of the women, the one with dark hair, almost smiled. Not in fear, not in resignation. It was the faintest curve of the mouth, the kind that precedes a storm. The capture was never the end. It was the first move in a game the king didn't realize he was playing. And across the hall, reflected in the Leviathan light, the true players stood waiting. They moved the women to a transparent cube suspended high above the gardens of phosphorescent fungi. The prison was designed for observation, not suffering. Soft light filtered air, a view that stretched across the royal grounds to the sharp lines of the capital city beyond. It was meant to disorient through comfort, to make captivity feel like privilege. The palace AI monitored them with cold precision. It tracked heart rates, pupil dilation, cortisol levels, synaptic patterns. Every exhale was measured, every micro-expression cataloged against a database of 10,000 species stress responses. The system expected fear. It anticipated despair. It received nothing but steady, unbroken calm. The readouts showed flat lines where there should have been spikes. No adrenaline surges, no elevated heartbeats, no signs of panic or distress. Just 3 humans breathing as if they were sitting on a park bench back home. A Thrumac officer monitoring the feed frowned, her secondary eyelids blinking slowly. She flagged the data as anomalous. This degree of composure defied every behavioral model in the Imperial archives. Captives break. They plead, they rage. They do not simply wait. One of the women began to hum, a low, steady melody that the audio filters identified as an old Earthfolk song, something about country roads and going home. She didn't look at the others. She just gazed out at the glowing fungal forest below, her fingers tapping a slow rhythm against her thigh. The sound was soft, almost swallowed by the hum of the life support systems, but it filled the cube with a strange, defiant normalcy. Their body language remained loose, unguarded. They sat with their legs crossed or leaned against the clear walls as if they were windows in a train. They did not huddle together for comfort. They did not avoid each other's eyes. Their silence wasn't the empty silence of shock. It was the full, heavy silence of people who have already had the conversation and are now merely waiting for the result. Fear was a language the Empire understood. They had charts for it, protocols, appropriate responses. This quiet resolve was a dialect they had no translation for. The king, watching from his chambers, saw only fragile creatures adapting to their new gilded cage. He saw their calm as a form of acceptance, a testament to his merciful rule. Minister Rock saw the same footage and felt a cold knot form in his stomach. He knew the difference between broken spirit and banked fire. He recognized the posture of someone who is not trapped, but stationed. Their composure was not passive. It was a choice, a weapon they had drawn the moment they arrived and one they held with a steady hand. The Empire was watching 3 prisoners. They did not realize they were being watched back. Every breath, every glance, every hummed note was a piece of data being collected, not by machines, but by the women themselves. They were learning the rhythms of the palace, the patterns of the guards, the weaknesses in the system. Their calm was the first move. A declaration made without a single word. And in the control room, the Thrumac officer's unease grew. She had seen terror. She had seen defiance. She had never seen patience this deep, this absolute. It felt less like surrender and more like a countdown. Minister Rock stepped close to the king's throne as the applause for the human captives faded. His voice came low, a gravelly whisper that cut under the lingering pomp of the ceremony. He did not look at the women. He kept his eyes fixed on his sovereign, a man drunk on his own spectacle. He said one word. "Girls." The king turned, his smile not fading but freezing slightly at the edges. He dismissed the warning with a flick of his wrist, a gesture he used for minor annoyances. He called it a worry from an old man who no longer understood the theater of power. This was a performance, he said. A lesson in humility for a species that thought itself beyond reach. The humans were props in his narrative. Harmless, ornamental. But the word held weight in the silence that followed. It was not just a label. It was a lens. And depending on how you turned it, the view changed completely. On Earth, that word could mean youth. It could imply innocence, inexperience, something fragile needing protection. It was the meaning the king chose to hear. It fit the story he was telling himself, the story of a benevolent ruler displaying his delicate new prizes. Minister Rock heard the other meaning, the one that spoke not of fragility, but of formation. On that planet, it could mean a unit, a pack, a bonded force with a singular, terrifying focus. It was a term that could describe a social unit far more cohesive and dangerous than any military squadron. Their loyalty wasn't sworn to a flag or a nation. It was sworn to each other. The king saw 3 individuals, isolated, alone. Minister Rock, who had studied the strange patterns of human socialization, saw a network, a closed system. Their calm wasn't personal fortitude. It was collective certainty. They were not afraid because they were not alone. Even here in a cage of light, they were a unit. His single word of caution was a seed. He dropped it into the fertile ground of the king's towering hubris and knew it would likely die there, unheard. But it was the only acknowledgement from within the court that a miscalculation had been made. It was the Empire's first faint admission that it might have reached for something it did not understand. That one word echoed in the space between them. It was a tiny sound, barely audible over the hum of the hall and the rustle of fine robes. Yet it was the first crack in the foundation, not a fissure wide enough to see, but a hairline fracture in the certainty of galactic power. It was the sound of doubt, and in an empire built on absolute control, doubt was the most dangerous substance in the universe. The king turned back to his audience, his smile restored. The moment was over for him. The old man's nagging was forgotten, but Minister Rock did not move. He watched the 3 women. He watched how the one with dark hair met the eyes of the one humming, a look that lasted less than a second. No words passed between them. None were needed, that was the true warning. Their communication was silent, instantaneous, and utterly opaque to their captors. They were not prisoners in isolation. They were a cell fully operational behind enemy lines, and the king had just reminded his minister what they were. Not women, girls. a distinction that, on their world, made all the difference. The gala was broadcast across 12 star systems. A live feed of imperial dominance piped into homes and public squares and starship bridges. The king expected celebration. He expected a transmission that would showcase his power, the final submission of a species that had long eluded his reach. He got a declaration of war. It was not delivered by a fleet. It was delivered by a woman taking one deliberate step forward. June moved without permission. Her lumanium cuffs glinted as she stepped out of the formation the guards had placed her in. The camera drones focused on her, auto-framing her face for the audience of billions. Her voice did not shake. It was clear, level, and carried the weight of absolute conviction. She stated her name. She stated her rank. A civilian attaché on a vessel under diplomatic protection. She named her crime. Not a crime she committed, but the one committed against her. Kidnapping. Piracy under interstellar law. She described the attack on their ship, not as a military engagement, but as an ambush. She spoke of the paralytic gas that flooded their cabins, the taste of metal on the tongue. She described being dragged from their quarters, the cold of the alien deck plating against her cheek. She made it personal. She did not address the king as Your Majesty. She looked directly into the nearest camera and spoke to him as an equal, an accuser. She described the parade through the grand hall, the way he had used his scepter to tilt her chin as if examining livestock. She called it an insult, not just to her but to her people, to the concept of dignity itself. Then she paused. The entire galaxy seemed to hold its breath. She smiled, a thin, sharp thing with no warmth in it. "I dedicate this moment to my husband," she said. The words were simple, a private sentiment made public. But the way she said it, the specific phrasing, it landed not like a dedication but like a signal, a coded message sent on an open channel, knowing only one person would understand its true meaning. It was a promise that this was not over. Talia spoke next. Her voice was softer but no less firm. She did not talk about the capture. She spoke of her wedding day on a mountainside in Patagonia. The cold wind, the smell of earth, the feel of her husband's hand in hers. She spoke of the coin he had given her that day, an old, worn piece of currency from his homeland. She said she still carried it, a small cold weight in her palm, an anchor to a world and a man they had tried to take from her. She held up her empty hand, fingers closed as if the coin were there. The gesture was a rebuke, a reminder of everything that was real and everything the Empire was not. The third woman did not speak. She did not need to. She stood perfectly still, her gray eyes scanning the room, the cameras, the face of the king. Her silence was louder than any words. It was a reservoir of potential energy, a storm held in check waiting for its moment to break. Her expression was not one of fear or anger, but of patient certainty. She was already looking past the spectacle to what came next. Together, they pivoted the entire narrative. They were no longer trophies. They were witnesses. They transformed the king's stage into their own courtroom, and the watching galaxy into a jury of trillions. Their testimony was not a plea for mercy. It was an indictment, a detailed, personal, and utterly damning account of arrogance overstepping its bounds. They had been brought here to be symbols of the king's power. They chose instead to become symbols of his fatal error. The broadcast did not show a victory. It showed the evidence. The attack on the diplomatic vessel was not an isolated event. It was a trigger. A single violent action that tore a hole in a carefully maintained peace, but it did not create chaos. It initiated a predetermined response. A sequence of events set in motion the moment the first boarding clamp locked onto the human ship's hull. The king saw a capture. Earth saw a start signal. Across the Empire's fringe, scouting signals began to vanish. Not with the explosive static of jamming or the fiery bloom of destruction. They just went silent. One moment, a deep space patrol cruiser was sending its routine status pings back to Sector Command. The next, the channel went dead. No distress call. No final transmission. Just empty space where a ship's electronic signature used to be. A long-range beacon at Visor Point, a critical navigation marker for 6 trade routes, fell silent at the top of the hour. Its absence was a hole in the fabric of local space, noticed first by freighter crews who found their automated course corrections failing. They had to switch to manual nav, their hands clumsy on the controls, wondering what ancient star had finally died. It wasn't a star. It was a light being turned off. A pattern emerged from the silence. The Imperial Strategic Command ran the data through every analytical engine they possessed. They looked for the signature of known raider factions, rival empires, internal dissidents. The pattern matched nothing in their databases. It was clean, efficient, and utterly alien in its methodology. There was no looting of the silent ships, no territory claimed, no demands issued. Only absence. It was a pattern of resolve, a signal, written in negative space, that humans had been insulted. This was not a military campaign as the Empire understood it. It was a statement of principle, enforced with surgical precision. The message was not, "We are at war." The message was, "You have made a mistake, and these are the first corrections." Minister Rock's instincts sharpened as the reports filtered up through the chain of command, each one drier and more technical than the last. He did not see disconnected malfunctions or unlucky pirate attacks. He recognized the quiet before the storm. He had seen it once before on a smaller scale, when a trading consortium had reneged on a deal with an Earth-based corporation. The response had been similarly swift, silent, and utterly devastating to the offenders. This was that same cold logic, scaled up to a galactic level. He bypassed the usual diplomatic channels. Using a secure old network meant for true emergencies, he alerted the court's few allied worlds. His message was stark, simple, and utterly confusing to its recipients. It read, "Humans have been insulted. They did not understand." They sent back queries asking for clarification, for threat assessments, for military dispositions. They thought it was a request for aid, a call to arms against a new enemy. They missed the point entirely. The message was not a request. It was a warning of consequence. It was a notification that events had passed a point of no return. The captivity of the three women was not the problem the Allies needed to solve. It was the excuse Earth had been waiting for to implement a solution they had already designed. The king had not started a conflict. He had handed them the justification to redraw the map on their terms. The rescue mission was secondary. The recalibration was primary. The Marthian diplomat entered the cube expecting fear. She found dark humor and the easy posture of a shared private joke. Her scales shifted through a spectrum of muted colors as her large, dark eyes took in the scene. She had prepared questions about their treatment, about their needs, about the political ramifications of their capture. They sat her down and offered her a synthesized fruit drink, as if she were a guest in their living room. The woman with fog-gray eyes spoke first. She talked about her husband. The stars knew him by a title that brought a certain hush to diplomatic circles. A name whispered in security briefings, a figure often discussed but never fully seen. She did not use that name. She called him Babe. The word was soft, domestic, intimate. It landed in the sterile observation cube with the force of a physical blow. It was a reclamation, a refusal to accept the Empire's grand, terrifying narrative. Her terror was not gone. It was simply outweighed by a deeper, more powerful connection. The intimacy was her weapon. They spoke of another figure casually, a man they referred to as the architect. They used the term not as a code name but as a simple job description, the way one might say the plumber or the doctor. He was a partner, someone who handled the broader strategy. The diplomat's brow ridges furrowed. This was not the desperate gossip of prisoners. It was the calm coordination of operatives discussing assets. They were not speculating on a rescue. They were confirming a plan already in motion. The Marthian leaned forward, her voice a low rustle. "You do not tremble," she observed, her compound eyes reflecting the three calm faces. "Your males, they are wrathful." It was not a question. It was a conclusion drawn from a lifetime of studying conflict. She saw that their stillness was not inherent. It was borrowed. It was drawn from a deep well of trust in the men who moved in the shadows beyond this cage. Their resilience was not personal courage. It was faith in a network. These were not three lone women. They were the visible nodes of a hidden system, the only parts of the machine the king could see. The diplomat understood this now. Each was a point of contact, a living beacon for a web of partners, resources, and plans that stretched back to their homeworld and beyond. Their value was not as individuals, but as connections. They were the focal points where the strategy converged. Their husbands were not just men. In the quiet corners of the galaxy, their names were already legends. They were stories told to frighten admirals and reassure allies. They were not soldiers. They were forces of nature given human form. The king had heard the stories, of course. He had dismissed them as primitive myths, exaggerations from a backwater species. He thought he had captured precious trophies. He did not understand he had caught the bait. The Marthian diplomat left the cube with a new understanding settling cold in her gut. The Empire was not dealing with a hostage situation. It was facing a distributed system with redundancy and depth. The king's mistake was a fundamental error of scale. He saw 3 women in a room. He failed to see the ocean of support, loyalty, and calculated wrath that stood behind them. He had hooked the lure. Now the entire unseen Leviathan was turning, and the line was pulled taut. The fight was not coming. It was already here, and the king was the only one who didn't know he was in it. Minister Rock made a decision that bordered on treason. He accessed a terminal in a disused communications annex, a room smelling of ozone and dust. His security clearance, decades old and forgotten by system updates, still worked. He typed a 12-digit priority code. The machine hummed, accepting the command that bypassed the king, the war council, the entire chain of imperial command. He declared a priority warning to allied worlds. The message was clear, final, and utterly terrifying. It consisted of 3 words. Humans have been insulted. He did not sign it. He did not request confirmation. He sent it and severed the connection, the terminal screen going dark. The phrase was not a diplomatic communique. It was a simple statement of fact, a point of no return established by events, not by declaration. It carried the weight of an epitaph for the king's reign. This was not a cry for help. It was a signal that Earth's response would escalate far beyond conventional warfare. It was a call for a multi-system coordinated counterstrike, a warning that the conflict would not be contained. The phrase was a trigger, pulling the pin on a grenade that had been resting in the Empire's lap since the moment of the capture. Entire planets received the message and sent quiet, frantic queries to Earth, seeking to clarify. We had no part in this. Other empires, upon receipt, did not mobilize to aid Caltherion. They began moving their fleets away from it, creating a buffer of empty space. Meanwhile, the women were moved to a private chamber deep within the palace's residential wing. It was not a cell. It was a suite of rooms with real windows overlooking the city, soft furnishings, a fully stocked kitchen, and a library of data slates. It felt like a high-end resort. The irony was thick and suffocating. The king's idea of safety was a mask that hid the Empire's imminent ruin. The comfort he provided was a final, profound misreading of the situation, a belief that softer treatment could placate the storm he had unleashed. The Earth faction was not seeking appeasement. They were fully prepared to convert a personal insult into systemic disruption. The capture was the spark. The warning was the fuse being lit. They had a plan, and the king's actions had merely handed them the moral and strategic justification to execute it. Their objective was not just retrieval. It was recalibration. The warning was sent. Across the network on a dozen worlds, receivers printed the 3-word verdict onto secure ticker tape or flashed it on silent screens. In military command centers, analysts who understood the context felt a cold dread settle in. This was not a negotiation. It was a countdown. The clock on the king's reign began its final, silent descent. Every second that passed was a second the Empire spent not preparing for what was coming, but believing the danger had been contained behind plush carpets and panoramic views. The minister walked away from the terminal, his footsteps echoing in the empty hall. He had committed an act of insubordination that could cost him his life. He had done it because he was perhaps the only one in the palace who understood that the real treason had already been committed by the king himself. The crime was pride. The sentence was now inbound. Caltherion's outer defenses were a legend written in star charts and fleet doctrine. They had never been tested because no one was foolish enough to try. The energy grids, the drone swarms, the minefields that stretched for 1,000 kilometers, they existed as a permanent statement. A promise of consequence for any ship that approached without the correct codes. That promise held until 3 shapes broke stealth on the edge of sensor range. They materialized from the void without transponders, without the complex diplomatic hail sequences required for safe passage. They flew under black flags. It was a deliberate psychological strike, a visual echo from Earth's nautical history that needed no translation. The flag of no quarter, the banner of those who operated outside all conventions. It was not a request for entry. It was a declaration that the rules had been nullified. Simultaneously, The Vox Radiant security network began to decay. It did not explode. It did not shatter. It simply eroded. Communication channels filled with a soft, hissing static. Sensor feeds glitched, showing double images, then triple, then dissolving into fractal snow. Automated defense turrets swiveled lazily, their targeting systems confused by ghost signals and false positives. The network was suffering a silent, systemic collapse, an electronic malignancy it had no antibodies for. In the central control room, a senior technician watched his primary monitor. His hands hovered over the console, fingers poised to input commands that no longer seemed to register. He isolated the anomaly, running it through every diagnostic filter they possessed. The result made no sense. He confirmed it twice, a cold knot tightening in his stomach. An unknown signal was broadcasting from inside the triple vault. The most secure location in the palace. The origin point was not a weapon or a smuggled device. The signal was emanating from the captive's suite. Inside that room, the three women continued their game of Uno. The cards flicked onto the low table with soft snaps. One of them laid down a draw 4 with a slight smile. It was a symbol of strategic calm under fire. Their focus on the trivial game was a performance of normalcy so complete, it became its own form of weaponry. They were not waiting for salvation. They were maintaining cover. The security locks on their door disengaged with a series of heavy mechanical clunks. The complex system of magnetic seals and reinforced bars simply powered down. The door did not blast inward. It slid open with a quiet hiss as if welcoming expected guests. The floor plan confinement dissolved in an instant. The room was no longer a prison. It transformed into a theater of anticipation. The view was no longer a privilege. It was a vantage point. The rescue was not coming from outside. It had been inside all along. The signal from their room was not a call for help. It was a beacon, a homing pulse for the chaos that had just arrived at the front door. The black-flagged ships were not the rescue team. They were the diversion. The real extraction had already been set in motion the moment the women were captured, a plan waiting only for the right signal to activate. The king's most secure vault had become the epicenter of his undoing, and the key had been sitting in a plush suite, playing a children's card game. The ship settled into the maintenance bay with a groan of stressed metal, a sound that should not have been possible. Every defensive grid, every automated sentry, every motion sensor designed to vaporize unauthorized craft had been silently bypassed. It did not land so much as it appeared, materializing in the designated space as if it had always been there. It was a ship built around no known design principles, a collection of scavenged parts and retrofitted armor that looked less like a vessel and more like a junkyard given sudden, violent purpose. The hatch hissed open on manual hydraulics. Bo stepped out. His boots hit the deck plating with a solid thud that echoed in the cavernous space. He moved with a loose-limbed swagger that was its own kind of weapon, a display of confidence that bordered on insolence. He wore no uniform, just worn fatigues and a jacket that smelled faintly of engine grease and something sharper, earthier. Moonshine. He did not scan for threats. He did not take cover. He simply stood there, a man who had just walked through the most advanced security system in the sector as if it were a screen door. His call sign was Wildcard. It was not a military designation. It was a warning. His entrance was not a tactical insertion. It was a personal visit. He looked up toward the palace interior, a grin spreading across his face that held no humor, only intent. "Always said I'd come get you, darling," he said, his voice carrying easily in the quiet bay. The words were not for the hidden microphones or the stunned guards. They were a promise made years ago on a porch under a different sky, now being cashed in. A small four-legged drone shaped like a raccoon dropped from the ship's undercarriage with a soft clatter. It scanned the area with a single glowing red eye, processing data at a speed that would melt Imperial systems. It let out a low synthetic chitter. "Yeah, buddy, I got your back." The statement was absurd, a piece of homegrown AI banter in the heart of a galactic empire. It underscored the sheer disruptive weirdness of his approach. He did not fight like they did. He did not think like they did. He was a variable their equations could not account for. He represented a specific kind of human lethality, not the clean surgical precision of a sniper or the overwhelming force of a fleet. His was the lethality of improvisation, of chaos. He was the guy who would use a diagnostic tool as a blunt instrument and a comms array as a bomb. He fought with whatever was at hand, and his imagination was his deadliest weapon. He was unapologetic disruption given human form. He was the first husband to make landfall. The breach was no longer an electronic anomaly or a distant ship signature. It was here. It was him, flesh and blood and stubborn will, standing in their maintenance bay as if he owned the place. His methods were a structured military's worst nightmare. They relied on doctrine, on predictability, on chains of command. He relied on instinct, audacity, and a deep personal fury that no manual could anticipate. He carried the scent of home-distilled alcohol and absolute inevitability. His arrival was not a possibility they had planned for. It was an event they should have known was coming. He was the proof that the king's rules, his borders, his definitions of possible and impossible no longer applied. The game had changed the moment the women were taken. The king just didn't know he was no longer the one holding the cards. The wild card had been played. He stood on the deck rolling his shoulders, and the game suddenly belonged to him. Where Bo was noise and disruption, the Reaper was silence and absence. He entered the palace not through a breach or a landing, but through a flaw in perception. One moment the hallway was empty. The next he was simply there. His presence did not register on motion sensors or thermal scans. It registered on a more primal level, in the sudden chill that ran down a guard's spine, in the way the air itself seemed to grow still and heavy. He moved with an economy of motion that was itself a form of stealth. Each step was placed with intention, each breath measured. He was not hiding. He was simply being overlooked, a shadow that had learned to ignore the light. His lethality was not the chaotic, improvisational fury of the wild card. It was precise, cold, absolute. It was the difference between a sledgehammer and a scalpel. Both could kill, but one left a mess and the other left a question. He carried a blade forged from asteroid steel, metal that had once passed through the edge of a black hole. It was not a ceremonial weapon. It was not a symbol of rank or heritage. It was a tool. Its purpose was singular and direct, a conclusion made physical. It hung at his side not as a threat but as a statement of fact. He represented another kind of human response. Not the willingness to create chaos, but the capacity to remove danger. He did not seek a fight. He sought a conclusion. His objective was not to engage the Empire's military might, but to bypass it entirely, to find the source of the problem and excise it. His motive was not political or strategic in any grand sense. It was relational, deeply terrifyingly personal. The vast political insult of the king's actions was, to him, a simple personal affront. It grounded a galactic confrontation in the most human of bonds, a man coming for his wife. He was the calm that exists in the second before a permanent silence falls. The moment after the breath is drawn and before the trigger is pulled. His entry into the palace was not an event that was recorded. Security logs showed no unauthorized entry. Camera feeds displayed empty hallways. He was a tactical anomaly, a ghost in the machine of Imperial security. He walked through their strongest defenses as if they were suggestions, his passage noted only by the occasional, quiet absence of a guard who had been standing post a moment before. He did not announce his arrival with boasts or challenges. He located the nearest officer, a captain overseeing the internal security lockdown. The man turned from his console and found the Reaper standing beside him. There was no aggression in his posture, no raised weapon, just a steady, unnerving focus. The captain's hand flew to his sidearm, but he did not draw it. Something in the man's eyes told him it would be the last action he ever took. The Reaper's message was simple, direct. It required no translation, no analysis. It was a statement of pure intent that cut through all complexity. He looked at the captain, his voice low and devoid of inflection, a flat line of sound. "Bring me my wife." The words were not a request. They were not a threat. They were an instruction. A final, non-negotiable step in a process that had begun light years away. It was the only reason he was here. Everything else was background noise. The Empire, the king, the war, they were all just obstacles between a man and the woman he was taking home. He entered last. There was no grand announcement, no dramatic fanfare. He simply stepped into the throne room as if he had every right to be there. His title was Head of Outer Operations, Executive of Planetary Strikes. He wore a simple dark coat, not armor, not a cape, no uniform of any kind. He carried no visible weapon. His power was not in his appearance. It was in his perceptual certainty. The air around him seemed to solidify, reality itself bending to his unspoken will. Guards raised their pulse rifles. He did not look at them. He did not raise a hand. The weapons simply died in their grasp, power cells draining to zero in midair. They became useless lumps of metal. A quiet, efficient nullification. He declined all cliché heroics. He did not posture. He did not deliver a grand speech filled with threats. He represented something far more dangerous than a warrior. He was governance through clarity, a walking embodiment of cause and effect. He looked at the king, not with anger, but with the calm assessment of an engineer reviewing a flawed blueprint. He declared the king's reign unsustainable. It was not a threat. It was a verdict, a statement of fact as simple and irreversible as gravity. The system had failed. The model was broken. It would now be replaced. His authority did not come from the empire's hierarchy. It did not derive from military rank or inherited privilege. It came from a clearer, more moral logic, a system of accountability that existed outside the king's gilded hall. He reframed the entire concept of power in that moment. It was not about the institutional force of fleets and legions. It was about the certainty of consequence. The king had acted without considering the consequences, and now they had arrived, personified in a man in a dark coat. He was the strategist, the quiet architect behind the galaxy-wide response. He was the man who had taken a personal insult, a single act of arrogance, and turned it into a coalition. He had woven together disparate threads of outrage and capability into a single, unstoppable tapestry of retaliation. The 3 black-flagged ships that breached the perimeter, the silent collapse of the security network, the precise extraction of the wild card and the Reaper. These were not separate events. They were movements in a symphony he had composed. He was the reason a rescue mission for 3 had become a demonstration for trillions. He was the mind. The others were the hands. Bo was the unpredictable variable, the chaos agent. The Reaper was the surgical instrument, the finality. Their wives were the heart, the unwavering core of resolve. And the king? The king was merely the subject. The problem to be solved. The architect's gaze swept over the throne, the banners, the bowing courtiers. He saw none of it as power. He saw it as clutter, an inefficient, prideful system that had finally generated an error it could not contain. He did not need to give orders. His presence was the order. His calm assessment was the plan in motion. The king, who minutes before had been the absolute center of his universe, was suddenly reduced to a component. A faulty switch about to be disconnected. The architect's work was almost done. He had designed the response, orchestrated the pressure, and now he stood in the control room of the Empire to observe the final result. He had not come to fight. He had come to witness the conclusion of his own design. The certainty he carried was so absolute it felt like a physical law. The king's reign was over. The math was undeniable. The 3 husbands entered the throne room. They did not storm it. They did not blast the doors from their hinges. They walked through the main archway side by side, their steps measured, their posture relaxed. The spectacle of their entry was in its lack of spectacle. They did not enter as conquerors flushed with victory. They entered as judges arriving to deliver a verdict long since decided. Their presence reframed the entire hall. The gold leaf and Leviathan bone chandeliers became not symbols of power but evidence. The gathered courtiers were not an audience. They were witnesses. Their collective vision was not of a galaxy conquered, but of a galaxy redefined. The old order, built on the king's arrogance and military dominance, was a flawed model. They presented a new equation, one where power was balanced by accountability, and strength was measured by the bonds one protected. The architect provided the strategic clarity, his calm gaze seeing the entire board, the endgame already calculated. Bo provided the disruptive willingness, the sheer audacity to tear down a system others considered immutable. The Reaper provided a personal, relational form of justice, a promise kept that transcended politics or strategy. Their wives stepped forward from the shadows near the throne, meeting them in the center of the hall. The circle closed. The 3 couples stood together, a united front. This was the true objective. The rescue was incidental. The recalibration of cosmic power was the goal. The king's grand theatrics were gone, stripped away. He sat on his throne, but he no longer filled it. He seemed smaller, the weight of his ornate crown suddenly visible, a physical burden pressing down on him. He was not facing a military defeat. He was facing the raw, unforgiving math of interstellar consequence. The gilded hall was transformed. It was no longer a theater of power. It was a courtroom. The banners of conquered systems hanging from the walls were no longer trophies. They were exhibits for the prosecution. The king's own court, still bowing in frozen terror, became the jury. They were complicit in the system now being judged. They had applauded his arrogance. Now they would witness its price. The king's familiar smirk was gone. His face was pale, his eyes wide with a dawning comprehension that was far more terrifying than any weapon. He was not looking at soldiers. He was looking at a principle made manifest. He saw the architect's cold certainty, the reaper's silent focus, Beau's grim amusement. He saw their wives standing straight and unbroken, their calm resolve the catalyst for all of this. The accounting he now faced was not for the capture of 3 women. It was for the insult to the bonds they represented. The math was simple, and the sum was the end of everything he had built. The reckoning was not about force. It was about cause and effect. He had acted. They had reacted. And now the final calculation was being presented to him, not on a data slate, but in the stern, silent presence of 6 people who had rewritten the rules of the game while he was still trying to play it. The only thing left was the settlement. A master display screen in the throne room lit up, not with a tactical grid, but with a political one. It was a map of known space, and it unfurled not as a battle plan, but as a ledger, a cold, hard accounting of leverage. Every flickering point of light represented a system, a planet, a power that had just received a direct encrypted data burst from Earth. It was not a call to arms. It was a notification of allegiance. A galaxy-wide cluster of powers had just declared in unison that the king's calculus was flawed. His empire was not a monolith. It was a collection of parts, and those parts were now choosing a different equation. Then the message came. It did not arrive on a diplomatic channel. It broadcast across every frequency, every open receiver, every public and private network in the Caltherian system. It bypassed firewalls and encryptions, appearing on screens from the throne itself to the dirtiest taproom in the lower city. It was a single, stark line of text, translated perfectly into every language and dialect in the Imperial database. It read, "This is your only warning." There was no second message. No list of demands followed. No conditions. The statement stood alone, a period at the end of a sentence. The silence that followed was more terrifying than any threat. The fleet that translated into the system's edge did not bring conventional warships. It brought symbols. The lead vessel's engine core was a captured dying star, contained within a lattice of impossible geometry. It was too large to comprehend, a physical statement that mocked the Empire's own naval power. Smaller craft flanked it, drones whose shapes were not aerodynamic or functional. They were psychological constructs, forms pulled from the deepest layers of primal fear across a dozen species, twisting shapes that suggested claws and teeth and things that moved in the dark. They carried no sigils, no flags of any nation or house, only absolute black, the color of void, the color of a warning that promised nothing but absence. The terms were delivered on a separate, secure channel to the throne. They were not negotiated. They were stated. Full cooperation with the immediate and safe release of all human prisoners, the complete and verifiable dismantling of every forward military installation pointed at Earth or its allies, substantial reparations to be paid in materials and technology, the value calculated by Earth accountants, and a full public and unequivocal apology from the king himself, broadcast on the same channels that had carried his victory parade. The list was not a proposal. It was a receipt. This was not a rescue mission. That objective had already been achieved by the men in the throne room. This armada hanging in the sky was a message, a final, unambiguous lesson in cause and effect. The king had chosen to act. Earth had chosen to react. And this was the shape of that reaction. It was a demonstration that their capacity for violence was so vast, so absolute, that they could afford to offer terms. The message woven through every engine hum and black flag was that mercy, when it was offered, was not a symptom of weakness. It was a conscious choice, a strategic display of restraint from a position of such overwhelming superiority that annihilation was simply the easier, quieter option. They were not showing mercy because they had to. They were showing it because they could. And that fact alone rewrote the definition of power for every system that saw it. The king's choice was no longer between war and peace. It was between acceptance and oblivion, and the clock on his decision had already started. The king pleaded. He capitulated. He accepted full accountability. His voice, once a weapon of command, was now a tool of submission, reading the terms of surrender from a data slate held in trembling hands. The three couples stood before him, not as victors gloating, but as architects of a new reality. Their return was guaranteed. They would walk out unharmed, unbound, their dignity intact. This was the non-negotiable foundation. They were redefining strength before the eyes of a galaxy. Their victory was not seized through annihilation, but demonstrated through restraint. It was a weaponized virtue, a display of power so complete it could afford to show mercy. The choice to not destroy the empire was a louder statement than any explosion. It proved their capacity for violence was so vast that its absence was the ultimate flex of authority. The king's military was still mostly intact. His planets were not glassed. His people were not enslaved. This preservation was not kindness. It was evidence Beau's rhetoric cut through the formalities. He leaned against a marble pillar, looking at the king not with hatred but with the detached assessment of a mechanic looking at a broken engine. "We rule through proof," he said. The words were blunt, simple, unforgettable. The proof was not in their fleet's size but in its precise application. It was in the silent disablement of his defenses, the effortless breach of his palace, the undeniable fact of their presence in his throne room. They had demonstrated an ability to enforce their will with such efficiency that further argument was pointless. The evidence was all around him. The architect's promise was quieter, colder, and far more disruptive. He stood with his hands in the pockets of his dark coat, his gaze fixed on the king. "If you don't," he said, his voice level, "we won't come back mad." He paused, letting the king and his court absorb the chilling implication. Anger was a finite resource, a temporary state. What he promised was something far more permanent and invasive. "We'll come back married." It was a threat that bypassed military doctrine entirely. It promised a deeper, more personal, and utterly relentless form of integration, not conquest but assimilation, not an attack, but a permanent occupation of his political and social structures until they were remade in Earth's image. Power was now codified in moral accountability as much as military capacity. The king's right to rule was no longer derived from tradition or force alone. It was now contingent upon his adherence to a new set of principles. His continued reign was a privilege granted by Earth's restraint, a constant reminder that his authority was now conditional. The victory was not written in the burning hulls of warships. It was etched into the king's somber, unresisting acceptance. His bowed head was the trophy. His forced compliance was the monument. A new social contract was written in that throne room, its clauses echoing across the comm channels to every corner of the empire. The terms were accountability for actions, restraint in power, consent in governance, and respect for all beings. These were not suggestions. They were the new operating system for galactic relations, and Earth was the administrator. The entire galaxy watched, through live feeds and scrambled diplomatic reports, as a new balance of power was cemented. It was not a balance of opposing fleets, but a balance of principle and consequence. It was an equilibrium where cruelty and arrogance would no longer be met with negotiation or limited war. They would be met with a decisive, principled resistance that valued rebuilding over ruination. The king's lesson was complete. The galaxy's education had just begun. The consequence unfolded with ceremonial mercy. The victory was not confined to the throne room or the silent armada in orbit. It rippled outward through the galactic communication networks, through the very structure of imperial control. Every enslaved race, every subjugated world under Caltherian's banner felt the change. It began as a whisper on the wind, a flicker in the data feeds, a sudden quiet where the hum of oppression used to be. Their chains dissolved. Figuratively and literally, in mines on desert moons, the explosive collars around workers' necks powered down with a series of soft clicks, falling to the dust. In processing plants, the shock staves carried by overseers ceased functioning, becoming useless rods of metal. The bio-linked binders that kept entire populations tethered to their designated zones simply unlocked. There was no explosion, no grand proclamation of freedom. It was a systemic failure of control, a silent retraction of the Empire's grip. The mechanism of their bondage just stopped working. Oppression was not just defeated, it was uprooted by the redefinition of legitimacy itself. The king's authority had been exposed as a fiction sustained by force. The new power, represented by Earth, derived its legitimacy from the consent of the governed and the enforcement of a moral code. The old system's foundation was not just cracked, it was proven to have never existed. It was a house of cards, and the wind from the throne room had finally blown through it. The personal bravery of 3 women, their quiet defiance in a gilded cage, became the catalyst for planetary emancipation. Their refusal to break, their calm in the face of the king's theater, had been a signal. It told every oppressed being in the Empire that resistance was possible, that the giant could be tripped. Their story, broadcast and whispered, became a spark that lit 1,000 fires of defiance across a dozen worlds. They were the proof that a single act of courage could have infinite echoes. The rescue mission transformed. It was no longer about extracting 3 individuals from danger. It became a galaxy-wide liberation. The objective had scaled exponentially. The husbands were not just retrieving their wives. They were dismantling the machine that had captured them. Their actions were a surgical strike against the concept of tyranny itself. The freedom of 3 became the freedom of trillions. A single stone dropped into a pond, creating waves that washed over entire star systems. Heroism was reframed. It was no longer the lone warrior against impossible odds. It became a shared relational enterprise. The architect's strategy, the wild card's chaos, the reaper's precision, and their wives' unwavering resolve, these were not separate threads. They were a single rope woven from trust and commitment. The victory belonged to the unit, to the bond. It demonstrated that true power was not individual might, but collective will. Strength was a shared resource. Earth's status was cemented not as a new empire, but as a stabilizing force. They did not claim the king's throne or his territories. They enforced a principle. They became the guarantors of a new galactic contract, one where freedom was the default state and oppression became the anomaly. Their overwhelming capacity for violence was now the backstop for peace, a promise that the strong would not be allowed to prey upon the weak. They were the gardeners, uprooting the weeds of tyranny so other species could grow. A history written in fear was rewritten with courage and mercy. The archives of the Caltherian Empire, which chronicled conquest and subjugation, gained a new final chapter. It told of a king's hubris and the 3 women who did not bend. It spoke of husbands who came not for conquest but for family. It recorded the precise moment the chains fell away, not with a roar but with a sigh of relief. The narrative of the galaxy shifted. The lesson was no longer that power demands obedience. It was that cruelty invites a reckoning, and that mercy, when chosen from a position of strength, is the most powerful legacy of all. In the aftermath, the thesis was stated with calm clarity. Humans were not what the king thought. He had seen their art, their diplomacy, their reluctance to fire the first shot. He had mistaken these things for weakness. He had confused a sheathed blade for a harmless tool. His entire downfall was built on that fundamental misreading of their nature. He was not defeated by monsters. He was outmaneuvered by a more advanced form of predator. They were not weak because they were gentle. The 2 qualities were not mutually exclusive. In fact, one enabled the other. Their capacity for compassion was not a flaw in their design. It was a feature. It was the refinement of power, not its absence. The king's empire operated on a simple binary: dominance or submission, might made right. The human model was far more complex and therefore far more dangerous. It understood that true control was not about forcing obedience. It was about managing consent. The architect stood near the dismantled throne, his hands in his pockets. He watched the king's futile attempts to process the new reality. He did not gloat. He simply added the final, clarifying note. His voice was level, a dry statement of fact that cut through the remaining tension in the hall. "We're apex predators that learned manners." The words were not a boast. They were an explanation, a taxonomic correction. They described an evolutionary path. First, the capacity to dominate any environment. Then the wisdom to do it with a minimum of unnecessary violence. The manners were not a mask. They were the point of the whole exercise. This gentleness was a force multiplier, not a sign of weakness. It allowed for alliances where the king could only create subjects. It built networks of trust where he built walls of fear. It turned entire star systems into willing participants in a new order, rather than resentful conquests awaiting their chance to rebel. Their mercy at the moment of total victory was not a lapse in resolve. It was its highest expression. It demonstrated a strength so profound, it could afford to be merciful. The king's power was brittle, shattering under pressure. Theirs was flexible, adaptive, resilient. Civilization, in their view, bends toward mercy when faced with overwhelming coercion. They had coerced the entire empire into compliance without firing a single shot at a population center. They had presented the king with a choice between dignified surrender and total erasure. By choosing the former, he validated their entire philosophy. He proved that even the most arrogant power could be brought to heel through the precise application of principle-backed force. The threat of annihilation was the stick. The offer of a peaceful transition was the carrot. Together they moved a galaxy. The capacity to be formidable is enhanced by mercy, not diminished. The knowledge that they could have turned the throne room to ash but chose instead to let the king remain as a figurehead under new rules cemented their authority. Their power was now viewed with a mix of awe and respect, rather than pure terror. They were the guard dog that didn't need to bite to prove its teeth were sharp. This made them infinitely more effective as a stabilizing force. Fear is a temporary motivator. Respect, even grudging respect born from a display of restrained power, is enduring. The three couples approached the king one final time. They did not smirk. They did not threaten. They greeted him with calm firmness, a quiet handshake that sealed the new contract. Their posture embodied the agreement. They were not his vanquishers here to rub his nose in defeat. They were the architects of a new system, and he was its first subject. Their collective presence was the living embodiment of the terms: accountability, restraint, a promise kept. The galaxy's memory of this encounter would serve as a beacon for generations. It would be studied not as a tale of battle, but as a case study in applied ethics and strategic dominance. It would become the new benchmark for conflict resolution, a narrative warning etched into the history of every spacefaring species. The universe was not left to the mercies of the strong. It was now for the first time policed by those who had mastered the hardest lesson of all: the choice to show restraint. The story ends where it began, in memory. The king's hubris is no longer a personal flaw. It is a lesson etched into the curriculum of star systems, taught to cadets and diplomats alike. It serves as the primary case study in the dangers of miscalculated ambition. The Galactic King became a cautionary footnote, his name synonymous with a specific kind of failure. The error was not in losing a war. It was in starting a conflict without understanding the opponent. His legacy is a warning whispered in throne rooms from one spiral arm to the other. The galaxy would never forget the price of underestimation. The cost was measured not in ships lost or territories ceded, but in a fundamental shift of power. It remembered the unnerving calm of the three captives in their gilded cube, their composure a silent language of defiance. It remembered the wrath of the husbands, a response that was not a wave of destruction but a surgical, galaxy-wide demonstration of consequence. These memories became data points in a new equation for interstellar relations. It would remember that mercy was offered, and why. The terms of surrender were not born from weakness but from a strength so absolute it could afford restraint. This was the most unsettling part of the lesson for many old powers. The humans had victory in their grasp, a total crushing victory that would have allowed them to carve up the empire for themselves. They chose instead to enforce a principle. They chose to prove that power could be wielded with a sense of responsibility. This act of mercy was more disruptive than any conquest. The encounter became a benchmark, a story told in the mess halls of freighter crews and the strategy rooms of admirals. It was a narrative used to frighten young officers into caution and to inspire dissidents with the possibility of change. It was a dual-purpose tale. For the powerful, it was a reminder that there were lines not to be crossed. For the oppressed, it was a promise that lines could be enforced, even against the mightiest of empires. It was a warning against cruelty and a promise of principled resistance. The message was clear. Actions born of arrogance would be met with a response calibrated not to the act itself, but to the principle it violated. The king's cruelty was personal, aimed at three individuals. The response was systemic. aimed at the entire structure that enabled it. This proportionality was a new concept in galactic politics, one that redefined justice. The gilded hall remained. Its Leviathan bone chandeliers still glittered, its marble floors still shone, but its meaning was forever changed. It was no longer a monument to conquest. It was a museum exhibit, a preserved artifact from a bygone era of unchallenged authority. Tourists from 100 worlds would walk through it, and guides would point to the spot where 3 women stood and changed history. The hall was the same. The context was everything. The spectacle was over. The reckoning was complete. The theatrical display of power the king so loved had concluded, but not with his chosen ending. The final act belonged to the quiet men and the calm women who rewrote the script. There were no more speeches, no more boasts, just the quiet hum of a galaxy learning to operate under new rules. The end of the king's journey was the beginning of the galaxy's. His story concluded with a quiet retirement under watchful eyes, a living reminder of the cost of pride. The galaxy story, however, entered a new chapter, one defined by a fragile, nervous peace, underpinned by the unspoken understanding that a new sheriff now patrolled the cosmos. Their methods were quiet, their justice was precise, and their patience was not infinite. The king's fall was not an ending, it was an orientation, a point on the star chart from which all future navigation would begin. The galaxy learned a new equation that day. Underestimation plus insult equals a reckoning written in mercy. Remember that the quietest people in the room are often the most dangerous. They hold their silence like a sheathed blade. Their composure is not absence. It is concentration. The story itself is over. The lesson, however, remains. It's etched into the memory of star systems, a permanent fixture in the calculus of power. A warning that the most formidable force is not the loudest threat, but the quietest promise kept.